Hey everybody, welcome back to another edition of Movies That Move We. Today we'll be discussing Chevalier. Yes, Chevalier. I don't speak French, so excuse me if I'm not saying this right. But we're talking about Chevalier starring Kelvin Harrison. Now you may recognize him from 12 Years a Slave, Ender's Game, High Note. He's been around for a sec. But to dig into this, who is Chevalier? Who was he? Why is he important? Let's dig in. Let's see. He was 18th century composer. You may have heard him referred to as Black Mozart. And no. There was one Mozart, there was one Chevalier. And the two of them, they were contemporaries, but their paths never really crossed, as was shown in the movie. The film is loosely based on the Chevalier's life, and his name was Joseph Bologne. That's the particular Chevalier we're talking about. In the opening of the movie, you see him challenge Mozart. And that sets the tone for the personality that you're going to see throughout the whole movie. He's confident, he has swagger, maybe a little bit cocky, a little arrogant, but it also kind of puts on display who he had to be as a Black man in a very white space. I found the way the movie began interesting because he was the illegitimate child of a plantation owner. His father owned him, his mother, and a slew of other Africans down in Guadeloupe. And so whether to take his indiscretion out of the line of sight of his wife or out of that community, he decided to bring his son to France. The reason why that's kind of an interesting way to open the movie with Joseph as an adult instead of seeing him as a child on the plantation is that's not the central part of his story. And usually when we do see films that feature a character that has been enslaved or has that connection, we usually see the brutality behind slavery. And you never see that in this film, but it's very clear, it's clearly understood that this is the underlying thing in the film. In real life and in the movie, he and his mother were reconnected in France, which again, not a lot of time is usually spent when you're speaking from the point of view of the slave narrative. Not a lot of time is spent on reunion as much as it is the separation and the splitting of families. So it was very interesting to see that his mother did come back, or not came back, but his mother was brought to him, and that he cared for her once she was in France. Those are just a few of the details that stood out to me. There was one thing that I did have kind of a question on, and I went ahead and looked it up. Again, in the opening scenes, he's brought to France by his father, and even though I don't believe that he was brought to France at this point in the story, he was sent to what's the name of the school? He was sent to fencing school, and at a certain part in the movie, he was called somebody's mulatto. Here we go. He was educated at Nicolas Tessier de la Boissière School. That was a fencing school. He was 13 years old at the time. He was portrayed as maybe a 7, 8-year-old by my eyes. At the time he attended that school, according to what I've looked up, he was mostly educated in France. So when people say, well, wait a minute, he was brought from Guadeloupe, did he come over knowing, how to play violin and what have you? It sounds like he was in France from a very young age. What I was getting to was there's a point where someone meets him and they say, oh, this is one of Boissière's mulattoes. And initially when I heard it, I was like, okay, he is of mixed race and he did attend that school. But I read something that said, okay, that was actually meant as an insult. And when I heard that, I was like, okay, that makes sense also because for those of you who don't know, especially back then, being called a mulatto wasn't really a good thing. The word actually means mule. So now you're referring to the man as an animal. And it makes it sound like, what it is. They didn't think he belonged there because they knew his background had at least 50% African ancestry in it. And while we've known in our more contemporary experience that France is a pretty open place historically ethnically, longer than the United States anyway. Again, they did still participate in the slave trade, but they were a little bit more open to having blacks move around within their community more unhindered than the United States at that time. But still, the thing that always came to the front was that, listen, you're very talented, you're cool peeps, but we're here and you're still here. That was highlighted when he was having an affair with, what is his name? Her name was, I think, Marie Antoinette also. Not to be mistaken with the Queen, but he had an affair with a married woman. Her husband was in the military. He was known to be a cruel man. And they talked about going away, being an official married couple. And he said, in France, it's illegal for a black man and a white woman to marry. And so she said to him, well, why don't you marry an African? Unless you don't like African women. Now, I don't think this was I'm pretty sure this wasn't a real conversation. There's a lot of license taken in telling the story of his life. But what he said next, and there are a number of little things in the movie like this that kind of gently re-emphasize, hey, everything that he did was from outside kind of space. He said to her, well, would you marry a black man? How come you didn't marry a black man? And it gathered her. She was pulled together and she was like, oh. And he said, look, if I marry a white woman, it's a crime. It's a crime. If I marry a black woman, I lose my title. And it also pointed out how alone and not attached he was in either community. There were plenty of black people in the community as servants, but he could not he couldn't engage with them because Chevalier is basically part of the Queen's court. And what does it look like, a member of the Queen's court associating with enslaved people or servants? No, we don't do that. We don't do that. And so that little moments like that hit me. And the opening scenes when his father left him at the fencing school and said to him, listen, when you're here, you have to be better than everybody else. Nobody tears a Frenchman down. I was like, man, that's the same kind of conversation I've had with my daughter, my parents have had with me, and Black parents have had with their children for generations. You got to be 10 times better to come close to being equal or being respected as being on par. And so the film highlights how he was a dedicated, magnificent musician. He was a composer, he was a violinist, he was one of Marie Antoinette's patrons, or she was his patron, I should say. And so he pushed his way up through the ranks. Again, his father was also a man of note, so that helped. But he still had to put in a lot of work and do a lot of things in a lot of areas. Nepotism was not going to be enough for him. And so him being supported by Marie Antoinette and being a friend with her, their connection was through the arts, was a big deal. Of course, he put on performances, general performances that those who were wealthy enough to attend concerts could attend, but he also held private concerts in her court. And so he lived a very good life. Now, why is it that we don't know so much about him? Well, the last few screens in the film, before the credits, point out that a lot of his music was lost or destroyed during the French Revolution. He was, on top of everything else, he was also part of the military during the revolution. He was appointed to lead a regiment of 1,000 Black men, and apparently he did that extraordinarily well. But somewhere along the line, and Napoleon is mentioned, destroyed his music, destroyed any record of a lot of his achievements. So what we know about him is minimal compared to Mozart. And of course, throughout history, literature, political spaces, we see where the Black folks don't get much mention in comparison to the white folks. I think with as little information is known about Joseph Bologne, Chevalier, I think this movie gave a decent portrayal of who he might have been, what some of his struggles were, even him connecting to his mother. They created a space where there was a connection between them, but there was still enough distance. She was speaking her native African tongue, and for as many languages as he knew, he didn't know that. So it's like they did a really great job of showing the split dynamics, the spaces that he didn't fit into, but how he managed to navigate those spaces and still be successful. It created a picture of someone who was surrounded by people but still very much alone and not able to make real connections in certain spaces. So if you have not seen it, check it out. It's on Hulu. This did have a limited theater release, so it may have been in theaters, it may still be in theaters in your area, but if not, Hulu is your man. Go check it out. And I give this 5 stars. I think it was very well done. Again, considering the limited information about Joseph, and it's definitely one that will bring up discussion. Again, this is the type of movie you sit your kids down in front of, because they'll hear a whole lot about Beethoven and Mozart. They will hear very little about Bolognese and Bolognese. Talking about food versus, anyway, they'll hear very little about him and all of his achievements compared to some of the other 18th century composers. So that's all I have for you today. Please make sure that you subscribe, like, share our page. Tell your wife, tell your kids. And make sure that you follow us on Facebook, follow us on YouTube. And until then, folks, see you next time. Bye.